Gord Hill is an artist, anarchist, political activist, and father. Gord is a member of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, whose territory is on northern Vancouver Island. He is an author and a graphic artist whose books include the Antifa comic book, the anti-capitalist resistance comic book, and the work we spend most of this interview discussing, the 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance comic book. Gord's art is beautiful, radical, and inspiring. His books educate their readers on the purposefully obscured realities of Indigenous life and struggle, from the Tainos of the 1490s to the Apache guerrilla wars of the 1880s, the 1990 Oka crisis, and the anti-pipeline campaigns of the 21st century. Gord's illustrations challenge colonialism's sacred cows and show just how brutal imperialism has been and continues to be. But his work also inspires. By tracing half a millennium of resistance to fascism and colonialism, Gord reminds us that nothing about the present system is inevitable, and that those who fight against oppression join a long lineage of Indigenous and non-Indigenous heroes who have lived and died in order to make the world a better place. If you haven't yet read Gord's books, you are very much missing out. We hope you enjoy our interview with Gord Hill. Okay, I'm here with Gord Hill. Gord, how are you doing today?
I've been good, thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and to be on Camus's podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
I have questions, like I said before we started. I have lots of questions about your work, questions about your politics. But I was wondering if you could start by just giving people who are going to listen a little bit of information, background information about you, your politics, how you became political, how you became an artist, how you became a political artist, that sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Gord Hill. I'm from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. Currently living in Alert Bay in our traditional territory. It's on northern Vancouver Island. And I first got politicized um, through punk, listening to punk music in Vancouver. There was a pretty vibrant punk scene um, throughout the 1980s, and it was in the late 80s when I kind of got involved in punk. Um, and at the time, I was actually in the Army Reserves, so I was going to training 2 days a week, and but then I started listening to punk music, and then a cousin of mine was really involved in the punk scene, and so I started going to shows, and that's how I started kind of getting politicized. And I ended up leaving the Army Reserve, and the first group I became involved with was an El Salvador solidarity group, because at the time, El Salvador was involved in a pretty heavy civil war. There was a revolutionary movement. The government was being funded by the United States. There was death squads and just a lot of repression going on. And I I just did I helped out with that group organizing rallies and events and stuff like that. And
Was this
then but then
CISPES?
no, it was VSAC, the Vancouver El Salvador Action Committee. Um and but as I got more involved in punk and the politics that were involved with punk, especially the anarchist politics. So then I just started to focus more on the anarchist movement, and I started doing a zine. It was called Endless Struggle, and I did that for a few years. And then 1990 with the Oka crisis, I uh, I was really inspired by that. So then I started to orient more towards Indigenous resistance, and I kind of that became more and more of my main focus through the early 1990s. Um, and I was involved in anti-fascist stuff as well at the time because Vancouver had kind of like a growing fascist movement, a bunch of different groups that were trying to publicly organize. So we were organizing against them. And then in 1995, there was the Chapatan standoff in the interior of BC with the Shikwepmek Sundance being put under siege by the RCMP and the NDP government. And then from then, Indigenous resistance just became my main focus. But I was also involved in, kind of still involved in the anarchist movement and anti-capitalist type of resistance. Um, so for my artwork, I've always drawn ever since I was a kid. I did artwork. And then I started doing political art with the VSAC, the El Salvador Solidarity Group. I did some posters for them. And then when I started doing my zine, I started doing more artwork. And then I started doing graphics for a lot of different groups and events. Rock Against Prisons. I would do their every year they would print T-shirts to send in to the prisoners and to fundraise. So I was designing their T-shirt graphics for quite a few years, and different logos for groups, and then posters and stuff like that. Um, and then in the late 1990s, I was involved with the Native Youth Movement, and I felt like a lot of our the history of Indigenous resistance was kind of being lost. Even recent events like Oka or the Chapatan standoff or Ipperwash, there wasn't a lot of information out about those events. Of course, there wasn't really an internet at the time either. So I started doing short 4 to 8 page black and white comics about these historical actions. Um, and I did them on 8 by 11 photocopy paper. So, and they're black and white. So if we showed up somewhere, we could get access to a photocopier. I could just make copies of these little comics, and I started distributing them. And then after a while, I had a collection of them. And then a friend of mine suggested I should add a few more chapters and make it kind of like a 500 years of Indigenous resistance. So I did that. And then another friend of mine, Alan Antliff, he had some books published with Arsenal Pulp Press in Vancouver. So I gave them a copy, and they wanted to publish it. So they did publish it. And that was their first graphic novel that they published. And then after that, they asked me to do an anti-capitalist resistance comic book because of the 2010 Olympics and the G20 summit in Toronto, which was the same year, I believe. So they did the anti-capitalist resistance comic book, which was also in black and white. And then a few years later, with Trump running for president around the 2016, 2017, Arsenal asked me if I'd be interested in doing an anti-fascist comic book. So that's when I did the Antifa comic, and I learned how to do coloring on my artwork. And so that one was in full color. And then after that, I wanted to redo the 500 years comic because I felt the artwork, my artwork had improved a lot, and I didn't feel like the first edition, the black and white one, really did justice to this history. And I had a lot more resources at my disposal now, especially with the internet. And so I wanted, and that's why we did the revised, expanded edition of the 500 years of Indigenous resistance. And mostly now I'm just raising my daughter, and still doing artwork. I'm doing comics and graphics and stuff like that. So I still do my art. Yeah.
Is all of your art political?
Well, I have my more politically oriented artwork, and then I do a lot of traditional artwork as well, which is in a sense political because you're kind of like maintaining uh, the traditions of your ancestors. And to me, it's like a form of decolonization by retaining this traditional art forms. And I also blend my political perspective with my traditional artwork at times. So I've done graphics that are traditional art forms where it's speaking about contemporary issues. Um, but yeah, so I do traditional art and painting and carving, and whatnot.
Is there a history of political activism in your family, of anti-fascist activism, of anti-colonial activism? I'm curious how your parents, your extended family, how they took your deep dive into politics and anti-colonial resistance.
Well, there were members of my family, some of my brothers and sister, and some of my aunties and that were involved with the Red Power movement in the 1970s. Um, and they some of them went to different actions in that, and they helped start a school here. It was like an alternative school with a focus on Indigenous culture and that. Um, and then that ended up becoming the band school here, which is it's now run by the band council, but they maintain a lot of the traditional singing and dancing, and they teach the language and stuff like that. So that I did have exposure to that when I was younger to some degree, but that didn't really affect me that much because we moved away from the reserve, and I was raised as a by grade 6, grade 7, I was living in South Surrey, and then we moved into Vancouver. And so I was kind of removed from the community and most of my family at that point. And that's why I joined the Army Reserve. I was in Army cadets for 5 years, and then I joined the reserves. Um, so it was more punk that had the bigger impact on me in terms of uh, making me politically aware and radical and being radicalized. Um, yeah.
So, like I said, I was reading your book, which we carry, thankfully, and we had a copy left, uh, so I could still pick it up and look at it. It's absolutely fantastic. Um, and one of the things I noticed, well, I noticed a whole bunch of things. One of the things about your book is that it's very graphic, and you make no effort to sterilize the brutality of colonialism. And on page 28, there's an illustration of a Mayan prisoner being burned alive by conquistadors. I was curious about what your thought process was when you created the book, the choice behind making it graphic and presenting an unaltered and sterilized view of colonial violence. I guess my question is that more of a conscious choice? Was that an unconscious choice? What was your thought process behind approaching your art in that way?
I was just trying to make an accurate depiction of the history and to show the violence of colonization. I didn't put a lot of thought into it though. It was just there's the battle scenes and scenes like what you're describing. I was just depicting them as part of the this story of colonization and the anti-colonial struggle that indigenous peoples were engaging in. So it wasn't a super conscious thing like that. I'm gonna put on full display the violence of colonialism. It's just a part. That's just a part of colonialism, and so that's why it's part of the story.
But with your book and your art and so many, works of history and sociology and archaeology, the violence of colonialism in North America and South America is just readily apparent for anybody who wants to pay attention. And yet it seems to me like the popular story that we tell both in Canada and the United States is that colonialism was far less brutal than it actually was, and trying to get people to wrap their heads around just how brutal the colonial project was, even at this late date with the art that we have and the science and the history that we have, seems really difficult, that people just don't want to accept it. I was wondering if you felt that way, and if so, why? Why do we still in 2024 have such popular resistance to the brutal realities of colonialism?
I think a big part of it is the educational system, that what we're taught in schools as we're growing up is a really whitewashed version of the history, and it minimizes both the colonial violence from the European colonial forces, and it also minimizes the indigenous resistance. So like there's kind of two main narratives that we're taught. One is that the European colonizers arrived and they just kind of steamrolled over indigenous peoples and who were kind of like helpless victims. And then the other one is that it was almost like a mutually beneficial process, the meeting of two worlds, and the European colonizers were somewhat misguided. And then there was unfortunate disease epidemics which wiped out all the population. And they're both of these interpretations kind of minimize the violence and the brutality of colonialism. And a part of that is because the nation states that uh, control the curriculum, obviously want to portray their nation state in the most positive light. And they don't want to say our country is the result of this brutal, violent genocide. So that's, I think, a part of why it's minimized. And then the another aspect of it is that the citizens of these nation states uh, are kind of like in denial, and they don't want to recognize that their country that they're so proud of, or that they have some level of attachment to, is actually the result of this genocidal process.
I think that's a really good point. Another, I mean, there's so many parts of your book that I really enjoyed. One of the things I thought it illustrated really well was how the Spanish allied with some indigenous nations to defeat other indigenous nations. And your book makes really clear, particularly in the context of the Mexica and the Inca, that the Spanish could not have done what they did without, indigenous allies. And I was reading this, and to me, that seemed in stark contrast to the narrative that a lot of us learn in school, which is that the Spanish were these military geniuses and that they conquered North and South. They conquered the quote unquote New World because, like you said, either disease or gunpowder or the false notion that indigenous nations saw them as gods. Um, but that actually they really used this strategy of divide and conquer really, really well. And that was the key, one of the keys to the success of colonialism. Do you think that popular history has purposely ignored the crucial part that indigenous people played, not just in resistance to the conquest, but in executing the conquest as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if we learn about Cortez and his conquest of the Mexica, uh, most of the history you see, it minimizes or even erases the role of these indigenous allies that they'd collected on the way to Tenochtitlan. Um, and these were armies of tens of thousands that marched with the Spaniards. And with the divide and conquer, the thing about the empires, just by their very nature, is that they're already divided, but they're held together by force. So these city states that Cortez and the conquistadors were able to rally were subjects of the Mexica, and they had to pay annual tributes. They'd probably been militarily conquered for the most part by the Mexica. And so they had a desire to liberate themselves from the Mexica Empire and to exact revenge upon the Mexica even. And so when the Spanish arrived with their new weaponry, and especially the horse, which was a big critical part of their military success, along with having indigenous allies. So I think that's why they joined the Spanish. But for the most part, it definitely is minimized, and it's kind of minimized to promote this idea of European supremacy. That it's just Cortez and a handful, like a few hundred conquistadors, conquers an empire of 5 million people. And when you dig a little bit into it, as you said, yeah, they had the critical part of that success was having all these indigenous allies marching with them. Definitely.
How is that history of, indigenous participation in the colonial project? If you can speak to this, how is that history dealt with within the nations that still exist? How does perhaps your nation or other nations that you're familiar with, how do they deal with that history, with that sense of indigenous cooperation with the Spanish to further the colonial project? And not only the Spanish, but the English and the French as well.
I think for the, I think for the most part, if you're looking back, it was the consequences of allying themselves with, it wasn't just the Spaniards, but like the British as well. So some of the nations allied themselves with the British in North America. And I think if you're looking at in the context of what's going on at the time, uh, these European powers arrive and they have these different weaponry and whatnot. And so a group that's in conflict with an indigenous group that's in conflict with another indigenous group sees this as beneficial to their cause to ally themselves with this European force, and the consequences could not have been seen. And it's more, I mean, I'm more familiar with kind of the some of the ideas among the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, because they played a vital role in helping the British be victorious, basically in the end. Um, and it's and the ironic thing about the Haudenosaunee, and especially the Mohawks, because the Mohawks were instrumental in a lot of British victories in countering anti-colonial indigenous resistance. So the Mohawk kind of worked as spoilers. Um, and of course, now today, the Mohawks are kind of at the forefront of anti-colonial resistance. So it's just looking back historically, I don't think anyone could foresee the consequences of doing this, but there was no sense of pan-indigenous solidarity. I mean, these were movements that did arise in the 1700s and 1800s of these like indigenous alliances, which weren't a part of, you know, there were mostly conflicts between different indigenous groups, and I mean, the European colonial forces were able to exploit that. But if you look at it from the indigenous perspective, they're trying to uh, make strategic alliances. They have these bitter enemies that they've been fighting for generations, like other indigenous nations. And so it's, I don't think it's like a big smear or mark against those indigenous nations that did that. Because if you look at the context, it's understandable why these kinds of alliances were made. Um, I mean, another example are the Crow. Like they were kind of like scouts for the U.S. cavalry and helped defeat the Lakota and the Cheyenne and that. Um, but again, these are like strategic alliances that nations made at the time and for various reasons. But yeah, I mean it's interesting to look at, but um yeah, it's I mean it would have been great if everybody just rallied together to force out the European colonial forces, but that just wasn't the reality. And if you look at Europe, I mean Europe itself was quite divided. I mean you have the whole history of feudalism and ongoing warfare between all the different kingdoms and stuff like that. So it's not like a thing that indigenous peoples have had this like some kind of problem. It's just kind of the nature of human societies and conflict and whatnot.
Yeah, they certainly weren't unique
Yeah.
in that sense. What so you mentioned pan-indigenous solidarity. I'm curious from your perspective, what is the state of pan-indigenous solidarity today that you have experience with either in British Columbia or in Canada? Because so many people, you know, me growing up, I grew up in the United States. I had almost no indigenous friends, no indigenous neighbors. And growing up, going to school, you know, if you're taught at all about First Nations indigenous issues, it's, you know, sort of monolithic. Like there are no separate nations, there's indigenous people. And you don't learn, in my case, until much later in life that you should, that, you know, indigenous nations are as diverse as non-indigenous nations. So what is the state of that pan-indigenous solidarity today in 2024?
I think it's much more common. I think indigenous peoples kind of realized with the balance of power as it is that there's a real need to engage in solidarity with one another. So most of the movements we've seen, certainly since the 1960s, have, I mean, with the American Indian movement, the Red Power movement, I mean, these were pan-indigenous movements. And a lot of communities, you know, people who engage in resistance are sometimes they're in a minority in their community, and so there's a practical need to engage other indigenous nations in solidarity work. Um, but there are some nations that are quite strong and independent, like the Mohawks, for example. I mean, indigenous solidarity played a big role in the 1990 Oka crisis. but at the same time, the Mohawks had the capacity to engage in that armed resistance against the police and then the Canadian military. But at the same time, they probably couldn't have been as successful without the much broader Indigenous solidarity and non-Indigenous solidarity movement that arose at that time. So I think it's really it's critical for Indigenous struggles today to have that type of solidarity, and I think it's much more common today because Indigenous people share a common history of colonization now, and I think that's what really helps build pan-Indigenous solidarity movements.
In the preface to your book, Pamela Palmater, she wrote something that really I found fascinating. She wrote, quote, "Indigenous peoples will experience the journey through this book in a different way. We will see ourselves and our experiences represented in the cultural beauty that is our brown skin and painted faces." My question, when I was reading this, I was immediately struck. How does indigeneity interpret skin color separate from colonialism and white supremacy? Because when I read her words talking about our brown skin, my question was, was there a consciousness of light skin versus dark skin before the Spaniards and the Brits and the French really introduced concepts of ethnic supremacy and white supremacy supported by colonialism?
It's hard to say. I think there was a, an understanding or a recognition that there were lighter skinned natives before colonization. Like
Did that
Crazy
have any
Horse.
significance?
What's that?
Did that have any significance or anything close to
Uh,
significance that's attached to it after, white supremacy becomes predominant?
I think it only becomes significant with the introduction of European colonial uh, activities. Because the one example that I kind of know of is like Crazy Horse. So Crazy Horse was said to be somewhat light skinned, and he when his family or his people would encounter white settlers, they would sometimes ask if he had been taken as a child from white settlers and raised among the Lakota, um, just because he was a bit lighter skinned and he had light brown hair, uh, curly hair. I think he was called Curly as a boy. Um, but that again, that's only like because they're interacting with settlers who are questioning his ethnicity. But I think historically there were light skinned, later brown skinned natives and darker brown skinned natives. But I don't think it was like an issue. Um, Not until you have the advance of colonization and the whole idea of white supremacy being introduced. Yeah, I don't think it was a big issue.
So I moved to Canada about 2 years ago from the States, and Canada, in a certain way, in my perspective, is much further ahead of the United States in certain things like land acknowledgments. I don't know that I'd ever heard of a land acknowledgement before I moved here 2 years ago, certainly not with the ubiquity they are today. Um, and I tend to have a very mixed opinion of land acknowledgments now that I've lived here for a couple of years and I've gone to, you know, shows and classes and meetings where there's always a land acknowledgement that's read out at first. In my opinion, while it might not be very popular, they seem somewhat performative to me. And I was wondering if you could speak to this. I don't know if it's a tradition or this trend towards land acknowledgments becoming ubiquitous, but without seeming to have much else that follows them up in the way of indigenous recognition or decolonization.
Sure. So one thing about the difference between Canada and the US is in Canada, Indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the population, but they have a significant impact on Canadian politics.
Mm.
Um, and in the United States, Indigenous peoples are, I think, maybe like 2% or something of the population, but you have a much larger African American population and Latino population, and they're much larger. So I can't remember the exact numbers. There's like 40 million African Americans in the United States, and so they have a much bigger impact on U.S. politics, and they're like a strategic force in American politics. And so I think you have much more kind of focus on African American and even Latino movements or struggles or social conditions, a bigger focus on those in the United States, whereas in Canada it's more Indigenous peoples. And with the land acknowledgements, I mean that's something that kind of began probably in the 1990s. Um, and at first it was, I mean, I think it's a positive thing overall though, because even in Vancouver, through the 80s and 90s, a lot of people were completely ignorant of whose traditional territories they're living on and organizing and stuff like that. And with the land acknowledgements, it helps to educate people that there is a people uh, whose territory this was before colonization, and it helps the non-native public to not only understand that, but to know who these people are. Um, but certainly over time, it is rather performative, and it's kind of like it's almost like a token gesture at this point, where even like politicians might get up and do a land acknowledgement and stuff like that, but there is nothing more more to it than that. There's certainly no concept that this traditional territory belongs to so and so we're going to make reparations around that. So it is kind of limited, but I think it's overall a, a positive thing because it does help educate people and remind people of the colonial history of whatever city or town or region that they're in.
What would realistic reparations look like, do you think? And I emphasize realistic because I don't know that it's realistic that, you know, the settler population of BC is going to be evacuated and that all of the private businesses that are on Indigenous land are going to be turned over to Indigenous nations. I mean, I don't know in any universe whether that would actually happen without a full scale revolution. So, what do you think realistically, reparations and decolonialism would look like in BC? Because we talk a lot. I'm in a lot of rooms where people talk about how we need to decolonize. We need to decolonize. And again, I just tend to lose the thread, and I wonder what do you mean by that? Realistically, what do you mean when you say we need to decolonize?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of two different approaches to the concept of decolonization, and it's similar to the reform or revolution uh, philosophical struggle among the left, right? Reform or revolution. So you have reformist decolonization things, which are basically reforms, uh, including indigenous languages, giving more political and economic control to band councils, revitalizing indigenous languages, hunting and fishing rights. So these are all kinds of reforms. The more revolutionary idea of decolonization is, in the slogan "Land Back," like taking land back, um, which was a movement that began in the 1970s following the occupation of Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. So a lot of kids went there, they went back to their communities, and there was a whole wave of land reclamations that occurred after that. And a lot of those land reclamations kind of became institutionalized and legitimized, and they still exist today. Uh, there are survival schools that were set up. Uh, on these reclaimed lands, and some of those survival schools became institutionalized. So there was a big movement of land reclamation, and there's still actions like that that occur today. Like Shutikaf is a good example of a land reclamation. They went back, went up to that area to stop the ski resort, and that that area is still being occupied. Um, so, I mean, reparations is I mean, that concept kind of also comes from African American experience about reparations for slavery. And there, they're talking about, I think, money, like financial reparations. Um, and here, I think reparations could take a form of, could be financial reparations for the land that was stolen and all the resources that have been exploited and whatnot, but also land. Um, Especially here in British Columbia, the reserves are quite small. Um, I think there's like, let's say there's 2,000 reserves in Canada, and like 1,200 or 1,500 of them are in British Columbia, and they're quite small and scattered about. So the reserve here in Alert Bay is quite a small island, and maybe half of it is reserve land. But I mean, I think that would definitely be a part of it. Like there needs to be more land, uh, other forms of reparation but it's just all that reformist stuff as well, though, that things that people are struggling to obtain now, which is like decent housing, water, things, infrastructure, things like that. Um, but you're always going to be limited because you're living in this capitalist system, a colonial system, um, that's based on the control of land and resources. So that's why you turn to the revolutionary perspective, because how are you going to decolonize? um, because you people can learn their language and maybe get a better house or something, but that's not liberating the land, because really what decolonization is liberating the land. You look at any anti-colonial movement in history that's been successful, it's based around the liberation of land. And until you achieve that, you're always going to be living under the capitalist colonial system. And in North America, I mean, you can't just think of an indigenous liberation struggle is going to rise up, because it's in the context of North America, which is like a multinational, advanced capitalist system. And so any revolutionary struggle that arises here is by its very nature going to be multinational. It's going to involve all sectors of society. Indigenous peoples will be a part of it. Settlers will be a part of it. African Americans, the Latinos. So it's going to be this big multinational type of movement. But then on the other hand, if you look at it, the context that we're in, uh, this idea of revolutionary struggle, it may not even be an option, because you may just, uh, I mean, we're facing a lot of crises now with the climate crises, economic crises. Um, these types of crises could create a situation that's not revolutionary, but which threatens the nation state, and threatens the fabric of society itself, like an existential threat to the society. So then you're not talking a revolutionary movement. You might even be talking about a survival movement of how are communities going to sustain themselves in these types of conditions. And then if you look at that, then you have a greater possibility for actually liberating land and territory in that type of a crisis situation. But I mean, if we look down the road, that's all we face is greater crisis. Globally, that's what we're facing. So
That's really
there's great
interesting.
potential.
Is that a conversation that's going on right now within, I don't know, within band councils or within Indigenous activists that planning for a shift into community survival in the face of existential threat? Is that something that people are actively struggling with and engaging with?
I mean, within the indigenous social movements, It's been something that's talked about since the 1990s. The band councils aren't really talking about it. I think the most kind of activity that's oriented around that might be community gardens
Mm.
that some band councils have um, helped fund and establish and whatnot. But I don't think they have the mentality that it's because we might get into the situation where we have to be self sufficient. Um, but I think overall, within in the indigenous movement, it's something that's considered and thought about. Um, and even among some elders who were alive during the Great Depression, they know they've went through the experience of a catastrophic economic collapse, where they everybody had a farm, everybody had a garden of some kind. And in fact, I've talked to elders who said they weren't even really aware there was a Great Depression because they were already so economically impoverished. Having a garden and growing food and hunting and being self-sufficient was already a way of life. And they were in fact helping settlers who were struggling. So they were sharing food in that with settlers who didn't have that type of resources. Um, so I think it's kind of a part of our history. Um, but I think indigenous communities will, despite all the dysfunction, uh, would would come together for the sake of the community because it's all families, and so everybody. I think a lot of people would come together and would work at at, at that survival and building self sufficient infrastructure and whatnot, and probably would be better. Would be more capable of doing that than a lot of other communities, which aren't really communities at all. They're quite fractured and divided and isolated. If you look at the settler communities, uh, I don't think they have the same type of community, really. Um, but yeah,
I wanted to ask you some questions, more questions shifting, well, not really shifting away from politics, but refocusing on art. Um, and I think your books are just beautiful examples of how anti-colonialism and resistance can generate incredible art, both politically and aesthetically. And I was wondering if it's evident to me, and I think to you that, resistance and anti-colonialism can engender incredible art. Do you think colonialism and capitalism are capable of creating great works of art as well? Or by their very contradictions, do you think that the idea of capitalist art is just inherently, I don't want to say problematic because that sounds like it's a personal objection, but just aesthetically less than anti-colonial or resistance art?
yeah. I mean, the only really example I could think of would be with like comic books. Because for a while when I was younger, I thought, well, I mean, if you look at a lot of the far right propaganda, like fascist propaganda, it's really crude,
Mhm.
some of it. Um, it's not aesthetically pleasing and whatnot. But with the comic genre, there's some really right wing artists that are have been quite successful, and their art is very strong and graphic, like Frank Miller, who worked on Daredevil, that the 300 movie is about the Spartans. So that was inspired by a graphic novel Frank Miller did. But he's quite right wing. He's a Trump supporter. And there's a number of other mainstream comic artists that were really successful. Like people really like their art, but they're very, very right wing. Um, and then now you're seeing more of the far right fascist imagery. It's some of it's quite strong as well. Um, so I think on both sides, if you left and the right, you have individuals who are very good at producing artwork, um, but some of them have just chosen to devote themselves to like right wing causes. So I don't know if I would go so far as to say capitalism can't create anything. I mean, capitalism is quite creative. It's It's just that it's more destructive than it is creative. But I think it can empower individuals to create works of art that are quite powerful and inspiring, um, but that serve a right wing agenda. I mean, even some of the Nazi Germany, some of their artwork and stuff that they produced was quite powerful as well. Um, but yeah, so I wouldn't say that capitalism is incapable of doing that. Um, it's you just have uh, people who are capable of doing good art on both sides of the spectrum, as it were. Um, I think art of resistance art is generally more, I find it more inspiring and more empowering, of course, because it's speaking to the resistance and the liberation movements. And that's where it's coming from. So I find it more, I mean, I myself find it more aesthetically pleasing and more powerful. Um, yeah.
What probably another difficult question to answer. What is like what are the primary responsibilities of the resistance artist? Because I think of somebody like Roque Dalton, who's one of my heroes, and he wasn't just satisfied writing poetry about the Salvadoran Revolution. He insisted on being a fighter in the Salvadoran Revolution because he thought that his art was not enough. It wasn't enough of a contribution to the liberation struggle. I wonder what your perspective is on, yeah, like I said, the responsibilities of the resistance artist. Is it to create art? Is it to create art and join in the struggle? Is it to create a very specific form of art? Is it to speak both nationally and internationally?
I think, I mean, it's up to each individual how they want to contribute and participate. But for me, my role as an artist is to communicate ideas of resistance and to inspire people and to empower people and to motivate people into the resistance, and also to raise awareness among people who aren't involved in any kind of resistance movements. So I mean, I see myself as basically a propagandist, to spread propaganda, um, and to try to be as effective as possible in doing that. So I think it's really up to each individual how they want to contribute. I think it's better for artists to be a part of these grassroots movements, to be a part of these acts of resistance and struggles. Um, the same way, like an intellectual who writes should be a part of these struggles, because that way their work is more grounded and authentic, and I think is shaped by the resistance rather than kind of being removed from it and doing something that you're observing almost from the outside of a movement that's in struggle. So I think you should participate more in the resistance movement, and that'll make your art stronger.
Who are some other artists that you admire who create works of resistance, whether
I
it's
think well,
comics or literature, any medium?
I think Louis Hall, who was a Mohawk, he was the one who designed the warrior flag. He wrote the Warrior's Handbook and rebuilding the Iroquois Confederacy, and he had a big impact on the Mohawk warrior movement from the 1970s onward. He passed away in like the mid 1990s, shortly after Oka. But he was a big inspiration because he was using his skills of writing and doing artwork, and it was all devoted to the Indigenous resistance movement. So I was really inspired by him. I mean, he had a lot of little things like just things like stop calling your reserve a reserve and start calling it a territory. So Ganawagi wasn't Ganawagi Reserve, it's Ganawagi Territory. And so he really promoted the idea of being a sovereign indigenous nation and the role of the warrior in that, in defending that sovereignty and things like that. So Louis Hall was definitely a big one. Um, some other artists that I liked because they were so strong with their graphics was Seth Tabachman. He did really strong black and white graphics for World War III Illustrated, which was a magazine. It's still published today, but out of New York. Um, and There's some native artists that I was inspired by. I think Art Wilson, I think he might have been a Gitsan artist, but he used traditional art forms with contemporary struggles. So he was doing artwork about some of the struggles of the Gitsan, like fishing rights and stuff like that. But he would do it all in traditional art. Um, David Neal is a Kwakwaka'wakw artist did a number of who's done a number of carvings, masks that are about contemporary issues. Like he did one about pollution and greed and things like this. And so those indigenous artists that do that type of stuff with the contemporary issues, they kind of inspired me too to use my traditional art forms for political uh, statements or whatnot. Um, I was somewhat inspired by Joe Sacco, who did the Palestine comic. They're black and white. From his experiences going to Palestine, that's where he wrote his comics from. And I really liked his style. It was very, very detailed. It was all black and white as well. Because for most of my life, I was doing black and white art because that was the the medium that we could duplicate the easiest, because we didn't really have access to full color printers and there wasn't laser copiers like there is today. So a lot of my artwork was all black and white, just for reproduction reasons. Um, yeah, I think those are some of the main ones. There's more, but in terms of politics and art, um, yeah, I think those are some of the main ones.
My final question, Gord, as an artist, as an activist, as an anti-capitalist, what gives you hope these days? Because, like you said, and I agree with you 100%. We seem to be living in times of crisis, if not existential crisis. In the news every day, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Trump, whether it's the environment, it seems to go from bad to worse. And for me, sometimes it can be a struggle to keep the flame of hope alive. So I was wondering what gives you hope in these troubled times?
Well, actually, it's all those crises. That's what gives me hope, because those types of crises create opportunities, and those are the type of opportunities that the resistance movements would seek. Um, so what I promote is a strategy of resistance and survival. And the resistance is important because it's how we build our movements and infrastructure and whatnot, but it's also how we protect areas that are going to be necessary for the future generations to survive and to live. So if you look at Elsie Pugtog, they were resisting the fracking. They're protecting their clean water, their fresh water resources. So that resistance is really important because down the road, that water is going to be how their future generations live. So the resistance movements are important for protecting environmental areas, environmental resources, if you want to call it, right now, and for building a movement that's more capable of acting when these crises arise or intensify. So we have a fairly broad social movements right now in North America. Sometimes they're more active, sometimes they're less active, but those movements are going to be critical when these crises intensify. And the crises are going to create even larger movements as people react to these new conditions. So I think there's a lot of hope for the future precisely because it's a future of crisis and that creates the opportunity. So that's what gives me hope. And it's just kind of like a mentality of having that in mind as we advance. And it seems like everything's insurmountable or uh, the system seems so omnipotent, but it's not. And that's what these crises are showing us, that the system is actually really vulnerable, especially this massive global system that they've created. I mean, it's like the Mexica. I mean, they seemed so powerful and omnipotent to all the peoples that they'd conquered. But within 3 to 5 years, that empire had collapsed and was overthrown. And that's just the nature of empires. And empires usually collapse or fall through a convergence of crises. That's what happened to the Soviet Union. That's what happened to the Roman Empire. So that's what gives me hope.
Well, very, very well stated, my friend. And you've given me hope, which is difficult to do. Gord Hill is the creator and author and artist behind the 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance comic book, the Antifa comic book, 100 Years of Fascism and Antifa Movements, and some other really wonderful works. I really wanted to thank you, Gord, for spending time with me today and talking about your art, talking about the resistance, talking about colonialism and anti-colonialism, and just giving me the privilege of hearing your thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks a lot for having me.
My pleasure. Take care, my friend. I really appreciate your time.
All right, you too.
See you.
That's it.